Hello and welcome to BYJU'S IAS. Let's take up the analysis of today's The Hindu newspaper by looking at an editorial from page number 6 of the Delhi edition. This editorial deals with the draft Environment Impact Assessment notification that was recently brought out by the Ministry of Environment, Forest and Climate Change. This draft EIA notification seeks to replace the 2006 notification, and it has already attracted a lot of criticism. So first let us understand what is Environment Impact Assessment and the process behind it, and then we shall carry out a critical assessment of the 2020 notification. See, in previous sessions, we have addressed the debate between growth versus conservation on several occasions. We have discussed that these two national objectives are inversely related to each other and the promotion of one affects the other. See, for any country, promoting economic growth is absolutely essential in order to fund socio-economic welfare programs. But promotion of growth comes at the cost of environmental damage, because economic growth requires exploitation of natural resources, and this leads to severe damage to our environment and biodiversity. While promoting economic growth is of paramount importance, it is equally important to conserve our environment and biodiversity, because the damage caused to our environment and biodiversity due to economic growth ends up affecting the weaker and the vulnerable sections. So the trick is in striking a balance between these two differing objectives, and the answer lies in promotion of sustainable development. So in the interest of balancing growth and conservation, every industrial project and every infrastructure project is evaluated for its environmental impact. This assessment of the environmental impact of an industrial or infrastructure project is known as Environment Impact Assessment, and this is a mandatory process for certain category of projects in order for them to obtain the required environmental clearances. Say in India, Environment Impact Assessment was introduced in the 1970s for river valley projects. Later, through the Environment Protection Act of 1986, the EIA process received legal backing. But until then, the EIA process was not well defined, and it was decided on a case-to-case basis. So in order to streamline the process, the Environment Ministry brought out the first EIA notification in 1994 as per the provisions of the Environment Protection Act. This was later replaced by the updated 2006 notification, which is currently in effect, and the draft 2020 notification seeks to replace the 2006 notification. See, this is how a generalized EIA process flowchart looks like. The key stakeholders involved in the EIA process include the project proponent or the project developer. Then the project proponent will have to hire the services of a project consultant who has been approved by the Environment Ministry for preparing the EIA reports. These environmental consulting agencies specialize in the preparation of EIA reports, and they would have obtained prior approval from the Environment Ministry. Then the Central Pollution Control Board and the State Pollution Control Board play a key role in the implementation of the EIA process. Then of course, the Central Environment Ministry, its expert appraisal committees, and even the State Environment Ministry and its expert committees play a key role. And finally, at the grassroots level, even the district administration is seen as one of the stakeholders. Apart from these stakeholders who represent the project proponent and the government, the 2006 EIA notification also considers the project affected population as a key stakeholder. In fact, the 2006 EIA notification has given a very high priority for the project affected local communities to raise their concerns through the process of public hearing and public consultation. In fact, this is one of the most important stages in the entire EIA process. So if you look at the different stages involved in the EIA process, it includes screening, scoping, the preparation of the EIA report, public hearing, and finally appraisal. Under the screening stage, the project proponent submits a formal application to the concerned authorities, highlighting the key project details, the scale of investment, and the exact location of the project. Based on these details identified in the screening round, the projects are categorized into different categories to decide whether they have to go through the EIA process or not. According to the 2006 notification, projects are categorized into Category A projects, Category B projects and Category C. Within Category B, we have Category B1 and B2. Amongst these categories, Category A projects have to mandatorily go through the EIA process. Even for Category B1, EIA process is mandatory. For Category B2 projects, the EIA process might be exempted, and it is not required for Category C projects as well, which have the least environmental impact. Then comes the scoping stage, where the potential environmental impact of the project is assessed and possible mitigation measures are suggested by the project consultant. Then these assessment details are documented in the EIA report, which is submitted to the concerned authorities as mandated by the notification. Once the EIA report is submitted to the concerned authorities, then it is the responsibility of the district administration and the State Pollution Control Board to conduct the mandatory public hearing. This provides an opportunity for members of the local community who are affected by the project to raise their concerns. It also provides an opportunity for independent experts from outside the project affected area to provide their valuable feedback based on their expertise. This crucial feedback generated through public hearings is attached to the EIA report, and then the final report is forwarded to the appraisal committee, which holds the final decision making powers. Based on the merits of the project and its environmental impact and the suggested mitigation measures, the appraisal committee will either decide to grant approval for the project by providing the required environmental clearances, or it might decide to hold back the approval and send back the proposal to the project proponent, asking him to redesign the project in order to reduce the environmental impact of the project and come up with better mitigation measures. So in general, this is how an EIA process looks like. But the draft 2020 notification, which seeks to replace the 2006 notification, proposes to make key changes in the EIA process in order to make it easier for the project proponent to obtain the required environmental clearances. But of course, this comes at the cost of the environment and the well-being of the local communities. So that's the reason why the draft 2020 EIA notification has attracted a lot of criticism. And let us look at the key arguments that are being made in this editorial. See, the key drawback of the draft EIA notification is that it either seeks to reduce the scope of public hearing, or it seeks to entirely remove the process of public hearing from the EIA process. See, under section 26 of the draft notification, it has been stated that a list of projects shall be exempted entirely from the EIA process. But shockingly, these exempted projects include hazardous projects such as coal mining, seismic surveys for oil, methane and shale gas exploration, etc. Even though these projects are known to cause severe damage to the environment and biodiversity, the government is seeking to exempt them from the EIA process. Then under section 14 of the draft notification, a list of projects have been exempted from the need for holding public consultations. As we discussed in the 2006 notification, public hearing was the most significant stage in the EIA process, which provided an opportunity for the project affected population to raise their concerns. But the government is seeking to take away public consultation and public hearing entirely for certain category of projects, even though they are known to cause severe damage to the environment and biodiversity. The draft notification also places a restriction on the involvement of independent experts in the process of public hearing. For pipeline infrastructure projects that pass through national parks and wildlife sanctuaries, public hearing has been restricted to only those people from the concerned districts, which means that independent experts from outside the affected area cannot take part in the public hearings. Then the draft notification also provides for very liberal concessions for linear projects such as construction of roads and highways, laying of oil and gas pipelines, etc. Then the draft 2020 notification retains one of the controversial provisions that was found in the 2006 notification. This provision provided discretionary powers to the public authority, that is the local authorities, to exclude public hearing from the process of public consultation depending upon the local situation. But over the last 14 years, it has been observed that this provision has always been misused to bypass public hearing in order to speed up the grant of environmental clearances for infrastructure projects. Apart from these provisions that go in favor of growth at the cost of environmental damage, the Environment Ministry was seeking to push through the notification by providing a very short window for receiving public feedback on the new provisions contained in the draft notification. But thanks to the intervention of the Delhi High Court, the deadline for receiving public feedback has been extended to the 11th of August. So this makes it clear that the government is in a hurry to promote unsustainable growth at any cost, even at the cost of environmental damage and damage to our biodiversity. So that's the reason why environmental activists and conservation experts have been critical of the draft notification, and they have been pressing the Environment Ministry to have a relook at the draft notification and go for wider consultations in order to bring in progressive changes. Now let's take up a column from page number 6, in which the writer Stanley Johnny talks about the major foreign policy setbacks that India has suffered in its neighborhood. So in this context, he argues that there is a need for a new roadmap for India's foreign policy. See, after Prime Minister Modi rose to power in 2014, he aggressively pushed the neighborhood first policy in order to build upon India's position as a natural leader in South Asia. Under the neighborhood first policy, a very high priority was given to India's neighboring countries, and it sought to build upon the close relations that India traditionally enjoyed with its neighboring countries. Through his personal touch, Prime Minister Modi sought to accelerate India's neighborhood first policy in order to undo some of the mistakes that were committed by previous governments in India's neighborhood. But even prior to the neighborhood first policy, India's ties was flourishing with these countries, apart from a few areas of neglect. India was clearly seen by the smaller neighboring countries as the leader of SAARC and the South Asia region. The neighbors had acknowledged that the Indian Ocean region was indeed India's strategic backyard. After a series of ups and downs, India's ties with Nepal had relatively improved, and India was in the process of playing a key role in the drafting of Nepal's constitution. India's relations with Bangladesh had improved by leaps and bounds under the Sheikh Hasina government, and Bangladesh was seen to be cooperating with India in tackling northeast insurgency. And both the countries had made significant progress to resolve their land disputes and water sharing disputes. But India's ties with Sri Lanka had hit an all-time low before Prime Minister Modi came to power, because the Rajapaksa family, which was in power in Sri Lanka, had clearly taken a pro-China tilt, and a large part of this was a result of the then UPA government's decision to vote against Sri Lanka at the UN Human Rights Council, which was investigating allegations of war crimes against the Sri Lankan armed forces that were allegedly committed during the last phase of the civil war. The then Manmohan Singh government voted against Sri Lanka mainly because of the pressure of coalition politics, because the regional party of Tamil Nadu, the DMK, which was in power, was a key ally of the UPA government at the centre, and it forced the central government to vote against Sri Lanka and against India's interests, with the objective of pushing the UNHRC to investigate the abuse of human rights of the Tamil minorities by the Sri Lankan government and the Sri Lankan armed forces. But this stand of India ended up pushing the Rajapaksa family closer to China, and India's relations with Sri Lanka had hit an all-time low. But in Afghanistan, India was doing remarkably well, and it had invested billions of dollars in order to help rebuild Afghanistan, and it was trying to position itself in order to play a key role in the resolution of the Afghan conflict. Then with Iran, India's ties were looking up, and it had entered into an agreement to develop the Chabahar port. It was considering the proposal to establish an Iran-Pakistan-India gas pipeline. It was looking at Iran as a gateway for connecting with Afghanistan and Central Asia, and it was also collaborating with Iran in order to resolve the Afghan conflict. Then with China, India was cooperating and competing at the same time, and both the countries were seen to be managing border tensions as per established norms that had been agreed upon between the two countries. So overall, prior to the neighborhood first policy, India had firmly established its leadership position in South Asia and in the Indian Ocean region, and with the exception of Sri Lanka, India's ties with all the other neighboring countries was looking up, and it had even managed to tone down conflicts with hostile countries such as Pakistan and China. But the writer points out that over the last few years, India's neighborhood policy has suffered major setbacks. The SAARC grouping today has lost its relevance, primarily because of India's SAARC minus Pakistan strategy, and India's promotion of BIMSTEC as an alternative to SAARC has ended up sidelining the regional organization, thereby weakening India's leadership role in South Asia. Then over the last few months, India's ties with Nepal has turned completely hostile with the re-emergence of the border dispute, which unfortunately has not been tactfully handled by the Indian government. But with Bangladesh, India's ties initially improved due to the signing of the land boundary agreement, which resolved the enclave issue. But of late, India's domestic politics has had a severe impact on India's ties with Bangladesh. The domestic political rhetoric against illegal migrants from Bangladesh, who have often been labelled as termites by senior leaders in the government, and the controversy surrounding the NRC exercise in Assam, and the proposal to hold a All India NRC, and the controversial provisions of the Citizenship Amendment Act, has caused a lot of concern in Bangladesh about India's policies, and this seems to be reflecting in Bangladesh's increasing distance with India. Then in Sri Lanka, the defeat of Mahinda Rajapaksa and the election of Maithripala Sirisena came as a major blessing for India, and India's ties initially progressed under the Neighbourhood First policy. But the recent defeat of the Sirisena government and the return of the Rajapaksa brothers to power has cast concerns over India's relations with Sri Lanka, because despite the friendly outreach from India, recently the Sri Lankan government has been reportedly looking to cancel India's involvement in the construction of the East Container Terminal at the Colombo port. Then in Afghanistan, with the signing of a peace deal between Taliban and the United States, India has lost all the leverage because of its refusal to negotiate directly with the Taliban. Then the controversial Citizenship Amendment Act, which covers Afghanistan as well under its ambit, has caused a lot of resentment in Afghanistan, and this has affected the traditional soft power that India enjoys in Afghanistan. Then with Iran, India's relations has suffered immensely because of India's growing strategic closeness with the United States. First, it was the Manmohan Singh government, which was pressurized by the US government to back out of the IPI project, and the Manmohan Singh government even ended up reducing oil imports from Iran. But later, India had managed to work out an alternative route of payment in order to bypass American sanctions. But the signing of a nuclear deal between Iran and US had come as a blessing for India. But ever since Trump decided to quit the Iran nuclear deal and reimpose economic sanctions, the Modi government has been brought under a lot of pressure by the American government to cut India's trading relations with Iran, especially the import of oil. Currently, under American pressure, India has zeroed out oil imports from Iran, and even though it managed to obtain an exemption for the Chabahar port project, recent developments indicate that Iran is looking to sideline India, especially with regard to India's involvement in the Chabahar railway project. Then upon this, India's decisions related to the Citizenship Amendment Act and Article 370 has not been well received in Iran, and this has further affected the bilateral relationship. Then with hostile neighbors such as Pakistan and China, India's relationship has deteriorated to its lowest point in the last few decades, and India had to face its gravest national security crisis with these countries as a result of the Pulwama attacks and the Balkot airstrikes, and the recent border tensions with China. So the writer says that, all in all, India's ties with its neighbouring countries has deteriorated over the last few years, and India's position as the leader of South Asia and the Indian Ocean region is clearly on the decline, and it is being challenged. And according to the writer, this is a direct result of India's declining smart power in its diplomacy. See, facing ups and downs is quite common in the world of diplomacy, because global geopolitics is never constant, but instead it is always in a state of flux. So it is only natural for any relationship to go through a series of ups and downs, but the sudden deterioration in India's standing in South Asia is a cause for concern, because it has a grave impact on India's national interests. The writer says that this decline in Indian influence in its neighbourhood is a result of two reasons. One, India's failure to balance its ties with the United States and its rivals. And two is the impact of India's domestic policies on its external relations, and the hegemonic dominating attitude that India has shown in some of the smaller, weaker countries. See, as we have discussed in previous sessions, India has made it clear that it has rejected the Cold War era approach of non-alignment because it is outdated and not relevant in today's world. But India has always reiterated that despite rejecting the non-aligned approach of the Cold War era, it continues to believe in the principle of strategic autonomy, which happens to be the foundational principle of Indian diplomacy. But the writer says that, in practice, India has not been able to follow this principle completely, And this has led to a deterioration in India's ties with countries such as Iran, China, and others who share a hostile relationship with the United States. Because see, since the early 2000s, under the Vajpayee government and under the Manmohan Singh government, India started seeking closer strategic relations with the US due to inevitable geopolitical circumstances. As India was emerging as a major power, it was essential for it to come out of its nuclear isolation, which was a result of the Western sanctions against India's nuclear program. But to come out of this isolation and to come out of this sanctions regime and to enter export control regimes such as the Nuclear Suppliers Group, India required the support of the United States, and simultaneously the American involvement in Afghanistan and Iraq gave common grounds for both the countries to collaborate and establish a strategic relationship. This relationship between India and US has grown leaps and bounds over the last 1.5 decades, but this has increasingly projected India as an ally of the United States, at least in the eyes of China. As we discussed, there have been instances where India has succumbed to American pressure and it has chosen to scale down its trading relationship with Iran, which has not been well received by the Iranian government. Then on the other hand, India's domestic policies that are designed to please the domestic audience primarily has ended up having an effect on India's external relations. This refers to India's decisions with regard to the Citizenship Amendment Act and Article 370. As we discussed, the provisions of the Citizenship Amendment Act has caused a lot of resentment in Bangladesh and in Afghanistan, and decisions related to Article 370 has provided a new propaganda tool for Pakistan in order to rally other Islamic countries such as Iran against India at international platforms. The decision of India to bifurcate the state of Jammu and Kashmir and establish Ladakh as a union territory could have possibly pushed China to rethink its approach towards India, and since China increasingly sees India as an ally of the United States, it might have directly contributed to its recent aggression shown against India. So a combination of these factors have contributed to the foreign policy setbacks that India has suffered in its neighborhood, and hence the writer is calling upon India to be more sensitive towards the concerns of smaller and weaker countries such as Bangladesh, Nepal, etc., and to engage in smart diplomacy by retaining its strategic autonomy without being seen as an ally of any superpower, and by not forgetting the unique leverage that soft power adds to diplomatic initiatives. But for this, India will have to reconsider the trajectory of its diplomacy, and it will have to lay down a new roadmap. Then we have a column on page number 7 in which the writer talks about the historical civilizational ties between India and Sri Lanka and how age-old wisdom can be used in modern tools to revitalize the bilateral relationship. But these aspects of India-Sri Lanka relationship have already been covered in our analysis on the 30th of November 2019, wherein I have covered the India-Sri Lanka relationship in complete detail, so I would request you to go back and watch this analysis. Please note that the relevant links for our videos dealing with India-Sri Lanka relationship shall be shared in the description box below. Now let's take up an article from page number 9 that deals with the draft data protection bill that is currently being examined by a joint parliamentary standing committee. See, this draft bill, which has been pending in the parliament, deals with the issues of data privacy and data security. This bill has been drafted by the government based on the recommendations of the Justice Sri Krishna Committee. As per the recommendations of the committee, the bill recognizes data principals and data fiduciaries. Data principals are none other than the individuals or the citizens who contribute data, that is digital data, to both government and private organizations. Data fiduciaries are the government and private organizations that collect data from data principals, and they also store, transmit, and use this data based on prior consent provided by the data principals. The draft bill tries to strike a balance between data privacy and national security, and it also tries to strike a balance between data privacy and the need to monetize data. So in this regard, the draft bill places a set of responsibilities and obligations on the data fiduciaries, and it accords a set of rights and privileges to the data principals. This bill also proposes to establish a data protection authority in order to enforce the obligations upon the data fiduciaries and protect the rights of the data principals. But when the bill was tabled in the parliament, activists had pointed out that the bill seeks to favor the data fiduciaries, particularly the government agencies, even at the cost of violating the individual's right to data privacy and data security. It is this shortcoming in the bill that has been pointed out by the Joint Parliamentary Standing Committee as well. MPs who are a part of the Standing Committee have raised concerns about Section 35 and Section 36 of the draft bill because they provide exemption to security agencies and government agencies in the interest of country's security, integrity, friendly relations of India, and in the interest of public order. Section 35 reads, "In the interest of sovereignty and integrity of India, the security of the state, friendly relations with foreign states, public order, all or any provisions of this Act shall not apply to any agency of the government." The problem with this provision is that the exemption has been granted not just to security and intelligence agencies, but to any government agency. This vague definition could be easily extended to cover any government department, ministry, or organization, thus weakening the cause for data privacy and data security. Then Section 36 reads, "Safeguards for an individual can also be suspended in the interests of prevention, detection, investigation, and prosecution of any offense or any other contravention of any law for the time being in force." This provision basically enables the government to suspend the rights of the data principles, and hence members of the Parliamentary Standing Committee have opposed these provisions, and they have asked the government to re-examine these provisions as they violate the right to privacy of an individual that has been guaranteed as a fundamental right under Article 21 by the Supreme Court in the landmark Puttaswamy case. Now let's take up an article from page number 14. In an interesting development, China has held a quadrilateral meet with Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Nepal. The focus of this meeting was on promoting coordination amongst these four countries to counter the COVID-19 pandemic and to focus on economic recovery by promoting regional connectivity amongst the four countries. See, amongst these four countries which took part in the meet, Pakistan and Nepal are already a part of China's Belt and Road Initiative. Now, in an interesting development, China has proposed to extend the controversial China-Pakistan economic corridor to Afghanistan, even though the alignment of this route passes through disputed territories claimed by India, such as Pakistan-occupied Kashmir. Along with this, China has proposed to extend an economic corridor to Nepal known as the Trans-Himalayan Multi-Dimensional Connectivity Network. These developments come at a time when India's ties with China, Pakistan, and Nepal have deteriorated, and at a time when India's leverage in Afghanistan has declined as a result of its lack of involvement in the Afghan peace process. Whereas on the other hand, these three countries have expressed support to the ongoing Afghan peace process, meaning they are ready to engage with the Taliban and provide recognition to the talk process that is going to take place between the Taliban and the Afghan civilian government. Now let's move on to the practice questions for today. Which of the following statements are correct? The governor can summon the house or each house of the legislature of the state to meet at such time and place as he thinks fit. The governor may from time to time prorogue the house or either house and can dissolve the legislative assembly. These powers of the governor are contained in Article 174 of the Constitution, and he can always exercise these powers at his own discretion. Amongst the given statements, the third statement is incorrect, so option B is the right answer. See, under Article 174 of the Indian Constitution, the governor has been given the powers to summon the house, to prorogue, and to dissolve the legislative assembly. But he cannot exercise these powers at his own discretion all the time. His discretion has been limited to very few cases, which has been clearly spelled out in the Constitution. See, these powers of the governor under Article 174 is restricted by Article 163. This article clearly states that the governor is bound by the aid and advice of the Council of Ministers, which is headed by the Chief Minister of the state. Even the Supreme Court has made it very clear, especially in the Arunachal Pradesh case of 2016, that governor's powers to summon the House, to dissolve the Legislative Assembly, and to prorogue the House are not entirely discretionary, but instead he is bound by the aid and advice of the Council of Ministers. But however, the governor does enjoy a certain degree of discretion in few particular cases. That is when there is a hung assembly in the state, and when there is a doubt on the confidence enjoyed by the government in the Legislative Assembly. In such cases, the governor can enjoy a discretionary power under Article 174 to summon the House in order to hold a floor test. This question has been asked because we have an article on page number 1 that makes a reference to Article 174 in the context of the ongoing political crisis in Rajasthan. According to this article, the Rajasthan governor has finally given his nod to summon the House as requested by Rajasthan's Chief Minister in order to hold the floor test and prove the majority of his government. Now let's take up the next question. Which of the following statements are correct? The global action to prevent and address trafficking in persons and the smuggling of migrants, or GLO.ACT, is a 4-year joint initiative between the European Union and United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime. It is implemented in partnership with the International Organization for Migration and UNICEF. Under GLO.ACT, there are 2 dedicated initiatives for Middle East and Bangladesh. All the 3 statements are correct. Option D is the right answer. See, this question was asked because we have 2 related articles on page number 2 and as well as on page number 14. This article refers to India's crackdown on an illegal human trafficking network which was targeting Bangladeshi and Nepali citizens and sending them across to Western countries, particularly European countries, by forging Indian documents. Then, according to this article on page number 14, the International Organization for Migration has warned that around 100 migrants fleeing war-ravaged Libya to seek refuge in European countries by taking the riskier sea route through the Mediterranean Sea are at the risk of drowning. See, currently in the world, we are witnessing 2 major migrant crisis situations. One is centered around Bangladesh and Myanmar. This refers to the migration of Rohingya refugees from Myanmar and illegal Bangladeshi migrants. The other migration crisis is being witnessed in and around the Mediterranean Sea, where thousands of refugees from across Middle East North African countries are fleeing war and conflict, and they are seeking to enter European countries by taking the riskier sea route through the Mediterranean Sea. Now let's take up the next question. Which of the following statements are correct? A digital signature certificate is a secure digital key that is issued by the controller of certifying authorities for the purpose of validating and certifying the identity of the person holding this certificate. In India, several ministries and government departments have mandated the use of digital signature certificate. It is considered on par with physically signed documents and has been given legal status under the IT Act of 2000. All the 3 statements are correct. Option D is the right answer. This question has been asked because according to this article on page number 3, fake digital signature certificates have been used by cyber criminals in order to target export firms. Now let's take up the next question. The Darfur region, which has been hit by massive ethnic violence, is located in which country? The correct answer is option C, Sudan. Please look at this map. This is where Sudan is located. It shares a border with Red Sea, Egypt, Libya, Chad, Central African Republic, Democratic Republic of Congo, Uganda, Kenya, Ethiopia and Eritrea. This is where the Darfur region of Sudan is located, which has been witnessing massive ethnic violence over the years. Now let's move on to the next question. Which of the following statements are incorrect? India accounts for 99% of the global tiger population. The Nagarjunasagar Srisailam Tiger Reserve is the largest tiger reserve in the country. Amongst the given statements, the first statement is incorrect. So option A is the right answer, because the question is asking you to identify the incorrect statement. See, India accounts for nearly 75% of the global tiger population, not 99%. This question has been asked because according to this article on page number 8, the tiger population in the Nagarjunasagar Srisailam Tiger Reserve has increased significantly. Now let's take up the next question. Where can you find the nomadic Gujjar and Bakarwal tribes? Can you find them in the Kanchenjunga belt of the Himalayas, or in the higher reaches of the Pir Panjal and the Himalayas, or at the foothills of Himalayas along the Indo-Nepal border, or in the deserts of Rajasthan along India's borders with Pakistan? The correct answer is option B. See, the nomadic Gujjar and Bakarwal tribes, who mainly rear sheep and goat, they are native to the higher reaches of the Pir Panjal and the Himalayas, and they can be found in Kashmir and as well as in parts of Pakistan and Afghanistan. This question has been asked because on page number 10, the Hindu carries an image which depicts children from the Gujjar and Bakarwal tribes being taught in open-air schools by government teachers. Now let's take up the next question. Operation Breathing Space, recently seen in news, refers to a climate action initiative of the United Nations led by developing countries to cut greenhouse gas emissions. Collaboration between India and Israel for developing rapid tests for COVID-19. A maritime military exercise amongst ASEAN countries to secure the Strait of Malacca. an exploratory mission of NASA and the European Space Agency to find water and oxygen on Mars and other near-Earth celestial bodies? The correct answer is option B. This question has been asked because we have a related article on page number 10. See, just a few days ago, we spoke about joint collaboration between India and Israel to develop rapid test kits for COVID-19. This joint collaboration has been codenamed as Operation Breathing Space. Now let's take up the next question. India is looking to procure missiles such as the Meteor, SCALP and Hammer from which country? The correct answer is option D, France. This question has been asked because according to this article on page number 11, the first 5 Rafale fighter jets are being delivered to the Indian Air Force as per the intergovernmental agreement that was signed between India and France in 2016. Now let's take up a practice question from the 2015 prelims paper. To uphold and protect the sovereignty, unity and integrity of India is a provision made in the fundamental duties. Option D is the right answer. Finally, let's take up a couple of mains practice questions. The first question, the draft EIA notification needs wider consultation and progressive changes. Discuss. The second question, in the backdrop of major foreign policy setbacks, especially in the neighborhood, India has to reconsider its diplomacy's trajectory. Comment. Kindly write an answer to these questions and post your answers in the comment section below. So this concludes our discussion for the day. Thanks for watching.